Hey folks, I've got a bunch of projects in the works cooking up for later, and I've been loving Edge of Eternity so far, so I figured this was a lovely time for a Precon review. I put it up to a vote, and my patrons narrowly chose the World Shaper Precon, so that's what we're going to look at in this video. Here's the format. I'm going to tell you what I think this deck is trying to do, I'm going to talk about the areas it succeeds in, and then we can talk about its weaknesses, and a set of card swaps that could help out with those. To start with, let's talk about the commander. Hearthhull, the World Seed, is a 4-mana spacecraft in Jund colors, with spacecraft being a new artifact subtype that's being introduced in Edge of Eternity. They're artifacts that can basically be leveled up by tapping creatures to gain some abilities, similar to crewing a vehicle, and most of them eventually become creatures themselves as well. This set also brings a rules change to the commander format where any legendary vehicle or spacecraft with a power toughness box can be in the command zone, and over on the podcast I co-host, we just did a tier list of all the vehicle commanders, which will be linked down in the description. Okay, so that's spacecraft, but what does Hearthhull in particular do? Nothing at first, but once it's had 2 power put into it, it gains the ability to tap, pay 1, and sacrifice a land to draw 2 cards and gain an additional land play this turn. At 8 charge counters, it becomes a 6/7 with Flying, Vigilance, Haste, and whenever you sacrifice a land, each opponent loses 2 life. Initial impressions. This seems like a solid value engine with some explosive endgame utility. If we squint a bit, we can kind of think of its first ability as having a floor of tapping to draw a card, since we'll probably draw and play another land from those 2 cards pretty often, repaying the 1 mana if it entered untapped. This is a fine starting point, but obviously there are a whole lot of things that amplify the power of this. The biggest one is things that can utilize lands in our graveyard. If we're able to get them back out into play in some form, this card represents a fair amount of ramp potential in addition to the value it provides. Another amplifier would be landfall effects that benefit from additional lands entering, and a third would be payoffs for permanents being sacrificed. If we can get some number of these online, the 2+ ability on Hearthhull will pack a ton of utility. The 8+ modality is a bit less appealing to me to get early on, since it makes our commander more removable without putting on much pressure in most cases, but it's a nice tool to have in our toolbox as something that can be turned on right before a big land sacrifice play. Overall, a nice package. So, how does this deck work with this commander? Well, there are 6 cards that can recur multiple lands from the graveyard, 3 instantaneous and 3 more gradual, along with a number of other cards that can sacrifice lands to perform effects. This, to me, represents a core ramp engine of the deck, sacrificing lands to perform various effects before spitting those sacrificed lands back out into play, building a lot of value and mana in the process. Mana and value don't win games, though, so what are our payoffs for futzing with lands? 3 main things. 4 landfall cards, 9 payoffs for sacrificing permanents, and 4 cards that check the number of lands in graveyards, with most of these payoff cards amplifying a player's board or pushing damage in some way. To support this game plan, there's a pretty wide and diverse removal suite, as well as a deliciously high land count of 42. So, to recap, this deck is trying to build mana and value through the process of sacrificing and replaying lands, before turning things up to 11 with a suite of permanents that perform powerful effects when parts of this cycle happen. The endgame plan is likely going to be a mixture of large creatures, moderate-sized creature tokens, and potentially an explosive burst of life loss from the commander, if things line up right. So, what do I think about this game plan? Let's talk about what I like about this deck, and since this is a lands deck, I'm going to mix things up a bit and talk about the deck's mana base first. Overall, there's quite a lot to be excited about here. First of all, 42 lands is a fair amount, but with a commander that both sacrifices lands and gives extra land plays, this number is perfectly reasonable. In terms of raw mana base quality, things are pretty great here. Great symbol counts in black and green, and a fine enough symbol count in red given that it's a secondary color. Like the last Precon I reviewed, we have a moderately large count of tap lands here, but given the high total land count, I don't really see this being an issue. More to the point of what's cool about this mana base, there's an impressive density of budget fetches here, a whole 10. I'll admit that I was a little skeptical of the 2 tapped fetches, and especially the 3 Capenna fetches here, but these start to make a lot more sense when you remember that the 4 most powerful land recursion spells in the deck return the lands to play tapped, which isn't a downside for any of these 5. And the upside of these is immense. These tie into all 3 of our main payoff types, those being lands in graveyard payoffs, permanent sacrificing payoffs, and landfall effects. The amount of utility these subtly add to the deck is really cool. Finally, let's talk about the typed duels. We have all 3 of both Tango lands and Bicycle lands, which can be fetched with any card grabbing a basic typed land. And yes, that includes the Golgari ones as well. The Commander team at Wizards is continuing in their quest to flesh out dual land cycles in Precons, and I'm super here for it. These are lovely for any players who want dual types and don't want to shell out for one of the more expensive options. Even just having a little upside over a basic tap land is really nice. Okay, so how does this deck build off of this strong foundation of lands? Let's talk about the core engine here. This deck is looking to sacrifice lands, oftentimes recur those lands, and generally get payoffs from the act of playing and sacrificing lands. In practice, this mostly works out. If there's one thing this deck can do, it's get lands into the graveyard. Between the Commander, 10 fetches, and 13 cards in the 99 that sacrifice lands, this deck is very consistent at finding ways to fill its graveyard with lands, should it want to do such a thing. For recurring lands, there's a somewhat lower quantity, although this is to be expected for a payoff card, and the deck for the most part seems high velocity enough to find these. It tends to churn through a lot of cards. When they are found, the impact can be big. Even relatively early in the game, finding one of the deck's 3 mass land recursion cards can routinely grab 4 or more lands. I ran a number of playtests with this deck out to the end of turn 5, and there were a surprising number of them where I finished with 10 or even 12 lands in play, which can set the deck up for some serious mid-game shenanigans if it can keep finding ways into non-land plays. How about payoffs outside land recursion? As I mentioned earlier, 2 major payoff types are landfall and permanent sacrifice, and these both play pretty cool roles here, particularly the former. Landfall is a great tool because it doesn't even require much setup. With the deck's 10 fetch lands and extra land play commander, you're already looking at anywhere from 2 to 4 lands entering per turn, and that's before taking into account ramp or land recursion. There are 3 powerful finishers utilizing this effect, as well as Tireless Tracker as a lovely value engine. Permanent sacrifice payoffs exist in a somewhat similar realm. The commander sacrifices a land every turn, and tack a single fetch land per turn on top of that, and you're looking at 2 easy triggers every turn, before considering the 13 non-land cards that can help with this task. A lot of these payoffs are pretty sweet. You've got classic Jund powerhouses like Corvold and Mayhem Devil, as well as some neat new ones printed for this Precon. I have opinions about the exact quantity of these that I'll get to a bit later, but the bottom line here is that I really like the structuring of this deck. This deck will be at its best when it's able to perform land recursion, but most of these landfall and sacrifice payoff cards have a high enough floor that they'll feel perfectly fine even if the deck is currently operating at a somewhat lower caliber. This, to me, is ideal for a Precon. You want to give newer players the chance to pop off and be the big bad sometimes, but you also want their deck to chug along and make them feel like they're getting to play, even if they're not having some sort of big gamer turn. And most of this deck's payoffs accomplish that goal. Moving on to this deck's removal suite, things continue to look pretty solid. 5 pieces of instant speed single target removal, 5 pieces of multi-removal, and then another 7 cards that perform some sort of hybrid role, being a removal engine or performing another task as well. I'll highlight some favorites here, but the key takeaway is that this removal suite is just pretty great, and there's only one card here I find remotely worth cutting. This deck is obviously a big Mayhem Devil dub, but I also love Windgrace's Judgment and Pest Infestation as powerful multi-removal options in decks that can afford to pay a bit of mana. There's 2 pieces of Graveyard Exile here, but it might feel like a lot more in practice since this deck is high velocity and has the capability to loop Bazooka Bog to its heart's content. We also have to talk about Planetary Annihilation. This is a wild new design, dealing 6 damage to each creature and forcing each player to sacrifice down to 6 lands. To discuss the card's merits here, it works satisfyingly with both Commander and this deck's sources of mass land recursion, and outside of that, I was nothing short of electrified to see this sort of effect printed in a Precon in the first place. I wear the conflicting hats of big mana player and advocate for incomplete mana wipes such as this, and while I don't want to derail this video by jumping away to talk about that for 5 minutes, I did discuss my thoughts on this card and some others from Edge of Eternities in a segment available to patrons and YouTube members, and there will be a preview of that at the end of the video. So that's what I like about this deck. A fair amount. But what do I dislike about this Precon? Only really 2 things. It lacks early game utility plays, and it has too much land sacrifice and sacrifice payoff, especially considering that the commander is both of these things already. So the way we're going to go about improving this is that we're going to cut some of the trickier payoffs and replace them with other payoff cards that are more flexible, and we're also going to add a handful of cards for purposes of smoothing the deck's early game and helping with setup. Unlike basically all of my previous Precon reviews, I'm not really going to be introducing any new elements to this deck. The ideas are already here, we just need to commit a bit harder to the better choices in this deck. Let's start with cuts. First, Loamcrafter Fawn. Unless you just want an outlet to discard lands, which I don't think this deck really wants, the two requirements to make the ETB good won't be lining up often enough. Scouring Swarm is honestly just a pretty mediocre card. Obviously flying is nice and there's a bit of explosive potential, but each of the conditions on the card are too difficult to meet to justify their respective payoffs, and it doesn't even have 2 power to get Hearthhold juiced up in one go. Worldbreaker costs way too much mana for the utility it provides this deck, so it's also gotta go. Sprouting Goblin at least accomplishes a couple tasks the deck vaguely wants, but the overall package here is still a bit meh. Likewise, I sort of see the vision with Groundskeeper, and I'd be okay with it if it was a 2-1, but as things stand, the use cases for it just aren't wide enough. Urg Spawn of Turg sadly just doesn't do enough for my liking, being neither a great early game play, nor a particularly ideal later play. Finally, this deck is just a bit overloaded on higher cost and trickier to use payoffs, and the two I'm choosing to cut here are Mazarek Crawl Death Priest and Centaur Vinecrasher. If you love these cards, I don't know, pretend I named 2 other payoff cards you like a bit less. The specifics aren't that important for these last 2 cuts. We're just trying to rebalance the ratios a bit. Now, onto the additions. First of all, and by orders of magnitude most importantly, Spelunking. Land untapping effects are very powerful in this deck, and the options out there other than Spelunking are quite pricey. Next up, I did cut some land sacrificing payoffs, and the logical replacement to me is Landfall. Lotus Cobra and Tireless Provisioner are both great mana engines, and Valakut Exploration is a great value engine that doubles as a damage win con in a big land fiddling turn, potentially working in tandem with the commander to one-shot opponents from shockingly high life totals. Next up, I want to get some higher utility 2-drops in here. This deck has a lot of late game potential, but is a little clunky right now, and hungry for early smoothers. Deeproot Wayfinder is a pretty sweet little guy that can filter and ramp a bit early, and maybe even a bit later too if we can keep a path clear for him. House Cartographer is a neat card that can help us keep a steady flow of lands to hand, and our commander's Station ability gives us an easy way to trigger survival once attacks are off the table. Another card I added was Undergrowth Recon, as this deck seems like it could use a bit more land recursion. Honestly, I think you could even look into adding another 1-2 beyond this, but the other ones out there tend to start around the $3 mark, and if you're looking for the best bang for your buck, you're going to be best off grabbing Spelunking and some landfall cards as your first upgrades over $1. The final non-land card I added is Hugs, Grizzly Guardian. This deck could use both another little boost of draw and another additional land play enabler, so I suppose you could add Case of the Locked Hothouse as an alternative, but I've already given that card plenty of attention on this channel, and Hugs brings that lovely Badger energy to the table. Those are the 8 non-land swaps, but I'm also choosing to swap 2 lands out. For one, the Wastes, which I guess was here as a basic typed way to pay Worldbreaker's ability? Maybe? Let's go with that. The other land card is Dakmor Salvage. Dredge is cute, but I don't think this is actually likely to ever do a lot outside of being a black tap land. In their place, I bring in Twisted Landscape, a pretty high-quality tri-fetch, as well as Kessig Wolfrun, which can be a mana sink and a way to give trample to one of the deck's large but non-trampling creatures. With that, my 10 swaps are done here. Sometimes I do more than that, but in this case the deck is just looking pretty good. It doesn't need that much extra help. The base list is a little payoff heavy, which I imagine most players will figure out at some point, and giving them the options of what cards to cut and which directions to push harder in is a reasonable task. The new cards for this deck are interesting. On the one hand, my 2 least favorite cards in this list were new editions printed specifically for this deck, which is a little odd, but some of the other newly printed cards are fantastic and do great things for this deck. Evando Brushrazor is a fantastic value engine. Horizon Explorer is a much welcome Amulet of Vigor effect with some neat upside, and Planetary Annihilation is a wild board wipe with a ton of different use cases. I love the creative design space this precon is exploring, and the strange and land fiddling nature of the deck fits the flavor of Edge of Eternities perfectly to me. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Architect for supporting the channel. Architect's category system and smooth UI really helps me in analyzing decks and making reviews like this one, and a link to the final upgraded list is in the description. I also want to thank my patrons, some of whom are on screen now, and if you feel like joining them and supporting the channel, you'll get access to a bonus video where I discuss my thoughts on some EOE cards for about half an hour. A preview for that video will start right now. This requiring a card discarded at random, I think, strays perfectly between having a cost that is payable by anybody, but also kind of expensive, if that makes sense. Something I don't like about basic ward is that for those higher ward values, when you get to 2, 3, I think 4 on a couple cards, even more so in some cases, The issue I have there is just that it really kind of punishes higher costed removal. Like, in principle, if we think about kind of what different removal costs are intended to do in Commander, let's say, uh, if you're running a Path to Exile, you may Path to Exile something and then play a 3-drop with it. That's just the general utility of the card. It can be weaved in, but you can also kind of just have it available a lot. Whereas something, if there's like a 4-cost removal spell that also does something else, then that's something where that's going to be taking your whole turn, but you're getting something else out of it. You're getting a little bit more value since you're only spending 1 card. So there's trade-offs here. With that said, I think the lower costed one generally is more popular and more effective in a lot of circumstances, and I think Ward only amplifies this because if something has Ward 3, you have 4 mana, you literally cannot target it if you have a 3 or 4 mana removal spell. Whereas